Welcome everyone. I can see you all ticking in. I'll just let you all join. Participants ticking up well. Whilst you're doing that, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, that would be great. So it's always good to know a bit more about who's on. You can, what can you tell us? Tell us where you are. Tell us give us a weather report. I've got my nice relaxed linen shirt on for the occasion. So yeah. So use the chat function to tell us who we are. So we've got sunny Cornwall. Hi Gary, Cornwall. We have a prize here. Well, Southwest is well represented. It's good. We have a prize for the furthest away. I'm not quite sure what it is. Yeah, but, yeah, we could for the person joining us from furthest. I've got Muddy Edinburgh, Charlotte. Thanks. Muggy. Excellent. They're coming in thick and fast. So I think we will make a start. If that's, I think we have participants still ticking up. We're nearly at 200. I'm very impressed that 200 of you have chosen to take on a day like this to talk about electricity market arrangements. But that's the theme, the discussion for today: unpacking the review of electricity market arrangements. I'm Merlin Hyman, I'm Chief Exec of Regen. I'll be your kind of host, if you like, for today, and I'll introduce the panel shortly. For those of you that I think probably most of you know who Regen is, but we're a centre of expertise in the net zero energy transition, and we work a lot on the kind of the systemic changes required to achieve a net zero power system. You can, of course, join Regen, which if any of you have left the form down the back of the sofa so far, you're always welcome to do it. Do that via the website. So let's kick off. So the other day I was driving my daughter on a Saturday morning to an audition, much too early, and somewhat to my surprise, I heard Boris come on the Today programme and start talking about the intricacies of power markets, describing them as, I think, ludicrous, I think was the phrase he used. So obviously that's a slightly less relevant introduction than it might have been a week or so ago, but I think it does illustrate kind of the way power markets work has become quite an important topic, and I guess that's driven by a number of factors, but most obviously by the soaring costs of energy and the political realities of that. Of course, before we started hearing from Boris about kind of potential short-term, immediate changes, and we started to see articles in the press around that, we also were already aware that the government had launched in its, I think it's in its net zero strategy or in the British energy security strategy or in both, and one of those many strategies, they'd announced a review of electricity market arrangements, so a full kind of rethink of how the power market works, and that we were expecting to be a fairly steady, sober document. But as we began hearing on the press and listening to Boris on Today, we began to realise that there was also potential of more short-term changes, and we found quite a lot of people in the industry kind of wanting to understand more, perhaps wake up a little bit more to the fact that this was a serious proposition and might lead to significant change that might be very significant for your business models and the kind of your investments. We are now expecting a kind of formal government document before recess. I haven't seen anything to suggest we won't still get that document, and it's pretty much a kind of call for evidence. So hopefully it won't fall victim to the current how do we describe this situation, changes, fluidity in government. So we're still expecting a kind of document which is going to set out a number of options. We're expecting that pretty soon. So if you like, this is a sort of warm up, a kind of pre-brief, a kind of trying to help understand what this is all about, why we should care, why it's significant, what the key factors that we should all be thinking about, and as we put forward and encourage us all and really to get involved and make sure we have a say, so that we have a kind of say in shaping this pretty much key reform for the future of net zero and for everyone involved in low carbon energy. Okay, so in terms of just how we're going to run things, pretty simple. We've got a panel. I'll introduce them in a minute. We'll do the introductions. Johnny's going to do a little bit of a kind of an intro to some of the some of the context and background and some of the objectives, and then we're going to open up for discussion. Like it to be an interactive session, so please do use the chat. You can share ideas, thoughts, links, business cards, whatever else. Always good in these events. Actually, one of the things that online sessions have seemed to enable, it's almost like a parallel conference alongside, and we usually share the notes of that afterwards as well. And then you can use the Q&A function if you want to ask specific questions. Now, we've got quite a lot of people here, so we're probably not going to be able to take each individual question, but we'll be across those, looking at those and kind of drawing them into the conversation. So that's enough introduction, I think. I think, as I said, what we'll do, let us introduce our panel. So just at this point, we'll just sort of if you give your name, rank, and serial number, Kathy, and first maybe, and just a little bit of background about your experience.
Kathy McClay, I'm the Director of Trading and Optimization at Semcor, which has quite a lot of flexible plant in the UK. I've been working in the energy markets. I joined just prior to the beginning of NITA, so over 20 years, although I know I don't look old enough. And I spent the 4 years before Semcor working at National Grid as Head of Commercial and Head of Future Markets.
Excellent, perfect. Thank you, Kathy. Simon, we come to you.
Hi everyone, my name's Simon Gill. I'm with Regen, Associate Director for Scotland, with a focus particularly on Scotland. So part of what I'm hoping to talk and explore a little bit is the implications for the regions of GB of some of these market reform options. Prior to being at Regen, I was at Scottish Government for 5 years, where I worked in electricity sort of system development and then broader energy system planning. Thanks, Merlin.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon. And Johnny, do you want to introduce yourself, and then perhaps we could go straight into your kind of warm-up?
Yeah. Thanks, Merlin. Yeah, I'm Johnny Gowdy, a director at Regen, and I've actually been working in the energy sector now for getting on for 30 odd years, but the first half of my career was working in oil and gas. So whenever NETA was being brought in, Kathy, I was happily ensconced in the oil and gas sector and didn't know very much about electricity at all. So a lot of what I've learned has been over the last 10 or 12 years working with Regen and trying to understand a little bit about energy markets, electricity markets, particularly in the context of the transition to net zero and how we can accelerate that. So what I've been asked to do to kick off the session is a little bit of history, I suppose, maybe just go back and talk a little bit about our current GB market arrangements, where they've come from and how they've evolved and developed. And I think that's important, partly because maybe quite a lot of people on the call haven't been working in the electricity sector for that long or haven't been involved in the market development for that long. And so that kind of knowledge and background is quite important. And also I feel understanding where we are now and where we've come from perhaps gives us a little bit of insight in terms of how we might develop in the future. And there is a slight risk, I guess, in bringing in market reform without necessarily understanding the current arrangements, that we could end up going down the same sort of rabbit holes or the same sort of thought processes that have already been taken before. So I think I won't go all the way back to privatization. That would take a little bit too long, but I will go back to around about 2000, 2002. Kathy's already mentioned it, NETA, the National Electricity Trading Arrangements, which was kind of the big change that happened when we moved from having a central pool arrangement with largely centralized dispatch functions, and we put in place a a decentralized bilateral trading system. But what I mean by that was the ability for energy generators, energy suppliers to bilaterally trade with each other or via exchanges. And we decentralized a lot of the basic balancing functions. We also, however, created the balancing mechanism and the role of the ESO, the critical role of the ESO, to manage that residual balancing, manage the operability of the system, and ensure that shall we say, the fine tuning of the system is actually managed so that we keep the lights on and we remain operable. And that was a really radical change, and it's actually sort of fundamentally changed the way in which we trade electricity in GB, and it actually has kind of laid the foundation for what has now become quite a rich and complex, and some would say sophisticated, trading system that currently underpins the existing market. So NETA's back in 2002, and that was superseded by BETA, the British electricity trading arrangements, and that was the point at which Scotland actually joined in with England and Wales to create the GB energy market. Now, for some of the people on the call, it might seem strange that actually Scotland, up until 2006, was, in energy terms anyway, another country. So it was very much like a separate energy market. And you could say that that integration of Scotland is unfinished business. We're still in the process of trying to work out how we bring Scottish energy into the GB market. And that gets into the whole area around investment and interconnections and integration between Scotland and GB. And a lot of the issues that we're seeing at the moment with constraints on the system actually go back to that lack of integration between Scotland and the rest of GB. Since then, I guess other highlights would be in 2012, electricity market reform. And I definitely was involved with that. I can remember sitting through what seemed like endless discussions about how we were going to organize contracts for difference and the capacity market. Those were the two big things that came in under EMR. And just to be clear, I mean, EMR was specifically set up to deal with the situation of having a higher proportion of renewables and more decarbonization on the system. So it was a response in a way to the Climate Change Act of 2009. So some people say, oh, our current system isn't designed for net zero. And I guess that, strictly speaking, that is true. At that time, we weren't thinking about net zero. We were thinking about 80% decarbonization. But the elements that were brought in as part of EMR in 2012 certainly did envisage higher levels of renewable energy, higher levels of variable generation, and this issue about how do we support investment in renewables and at the same time maintain a fleet of what was considered to be gas-fired power stations, but it's obviously widened out now, and support them via the capacity market, given that their utilization rates were bound to fall in the face of lower cost, lower marginal cost renewable energy. So EMR was a big milestone along the way towards decarbonisation. There were other things that happened around that time. So in terms of supporting for decarbonisation, I should mention the European Emissions Trading Scheme. So the idea that we have carbon trading, and also the introduction of REGOs, so Renewable Energy Guarantees of Origin, which were meant to capture that value of greenness and enable generators and buyers of electricity to trade that value of greenness. And I think both REGOs and EU Emissions Trading Scheme, which has now been superseded by the GB Emissions Trading Scheme, have been challenged, if you like, in terms of their ability to really nudge and change the progress towards decarbonisation. There's been accusations of greenwashing across both of those, and both are open to kind of challenge. But nevertheless, there are two schemes there which are kind of running parallel to the main electricity market that can have very important impacts on that electricity market itself, and could, if used correctly, move us along the pathway towards a net zero. NETA, BETA, EMR, those are kind of the big ticket items, but there's been a huge amount of change which has also happened within the electricity system over the same period of time. And some of those are very mundane things, you know, code modifications that have been brought in, an endless reform around network charging, which we're still in the middle of, and is kind of unfinished business, particularly around TNUoS transmission network charging and the future of distribution network charging and the degree to which it should send locational price signals. And, you know, we seem to have been going through an endless round of review of network charging. Other things that I would highlight, the growth of the PPA market and the corporate PPA market, so the ability to trade directly between generators and buyers of energy over a long-term contract. And that's really a feature of the GB energy system, an important feature of the GB energy system, which does go some way towards this argument about how do you hedge, how do you ensure that you capture some of the value of low-cost renewables and pass that through to the consumer. We've also seen the growth of ancillary markets, frequency response, and now developing into reactive power, stability, etc. So again, really important sub-markets, if you like, but markets for specific services that help us to maintain the operability of the system overall. We've also seen the growth of flexibility tenders, particularly as regards constraint management on the distribution networks. They're now commonplace, I would say, particularly on the demand side. We'd like to see a little bit more flexibility tenders on the generation side as well, and that's something we can discuss. And indeed also looking at that in terms of the transmission network also. Lots of innovation around local supply, lots of innovation around creating local markets. More or less, challenging, difficult, still very hard actually to establish a real business model around local energy supply. Lots of people have looked at different options around that, and that's one of the areas that certainly Regen has been pushing quite hard in terms of trying to unlock that value of local energy. And lots of innovation now coming through around agile tariffs, etc., and the ability to sort of capture the inherent flexibility of many consumers, particularly in relation to electric vehicles and what we can do with those types of smart assets. I should also mention we've had the rise and fall of the retail market. So we've had retail liberalization, a massive expansion of retail suppliers, and then we've had a contraction over the last 12 or 18 months. So all that's been going on in the background while these other reforms are taking place. So what we have at the moment is a rather, some would say complex, maybe being a little kinder, maybe sophisticated market. We have a trading ecosystem. We have the ability to trade energy over multiple time periods. We have the ability to trade directly between buyers and consumers of energy, either in the market or via corporate PPAs or long-term PPAs. And we have a balancing mechanism that sits on top of that, which, if it works, and there's a question about how it's working at the moment and what are the challenges and pressures around that, but in theory, if it works, enables the ESO to carry out those fine-tuning functions to maintain the system balance and to maintain the operability of the system as well. And that is different to a lot of markets around the world. I mean, a lot of markets around the world still based on a kind of centralized dispatch, centralized pool function. A lot of markets around the world don't have that same sort of trading ecosystem that we have at present. So onto the current round of reforms. It seems like every decade or so, there's almost a need for us to scratch an itch and actually look at how we can change the energy system. And I suppose the current round of reforms maybe goes back to around about 2017. If you remember the Dieter Helm cost of energy review, which was commissioned by the government to look very broadly at energy markets and how they could be improved and how we could actually drive down costs for the consumer. I think that report that Dieter Helm produced had a lot of ideas in it, for sure. It was a little bit of a stream of consciousness, if I'm being honest, when I read it. It's quite hard to actually turn that into implementable policies. But there was a lot of ideas coming through there. And as usual with Dieter Helm, there's a little bit of renewables bashing. For some reason, he really doesn't like wind. And I don't think he's quite got his head around the fact that renewables are cheap, certainly in terms of the commodity costs of renewables are cheap. So there was quite a lot in there about system costs, quite a lot in there about trying to move towards firm power as a sort of tradable commodity. And there was discussion in there about moving away from very marginal short-term markets towards longer term contracts. And that's something that's a sort of a theme that we might want to pick up in the panel discussions. Since the Dieter Helm review, we've had energy white paper, we've had the energy strategy, we have the 10-point plan. And every one of those has included market reform, themes along, we need to value flexibility, we need to bring more flexibility onto the market, we need to transfer more value to the consumer, we need to make markets efficient and make them work well, and we need to manage this trade-off, or is it a trade-off, between low commodity costs and potential higher system costs. And how do we square that circle that we're able to maximize our utilization of low-cost electricity while minimizing the impact that may have on system costs? And again, that's a theme that we might come back to in our panel discussion. So the current immediate round that we've got in front of us at the moment, there's a number of initiatives that have been kicked off. National Grid and Ofgem are currently conducting a review of electricity markets with a particular focus around what would be a radical change to locational marginal pricing. So that's a different sort of model to the one that we have at present. It's a model that's been used it's been around for a while, actually, since the 1920s, in fact, in places like the US, Texas, Midwest, California, etc., and is being looked at by a number of other electricity systems, including in Canada, for example. That would be a radical change. And I won't go into the detail of that right now because we're going to get into the discussion, but it would change the basis in which we're trading. It would change the basis of the dispatch function, almost inevitably, probably towards a much more centralized dispatch function. It would move the risk associated for constraints where it sits at the moment with the ESO for transmission constraints onto the generators. And that will have an impact, certainly in terms of investment, certainly in terms of some of the locational price signals that we're sending to generators as well. Around that, and I guess superseding that to some extent, BEIS has now launched a review of electricity market arrangements, REMA. In our discussions with them, we understand that review is broader. They're looking much wider across all of the different arrangements for electricity markets in GB and everything that I've talked about previously. And their scope in terms of an outcome could be a really radical change, something like LMP or something of that order of magnitude, or it could be maybe more likely a more incremental enhancement and improvement of the existing market arrangements. So we're not really sure yet what their direction of travel is going to be. And I think, as Merlin said, that's why we're all really interested to see the call for evidence that they're going to put out, and whether in that call for evidence they are actually setting some sort of parameters or some sort of direction that they're intending to go in. And I think that would be very interesting for us. Now, it's all very boring, isn't it? It's all just market stuff. It's all very uninteresting. It's strange that everyone's on the call today, but I should mention that we've had COVID. We've had, well, we're in the middle of what is the biggest energy crisis since certainly the 1970s. I do remember the 1970s and the power going off and us rationing our energy at home. So we're in the middle of something really quite big now with the price rises that we're seeing, eye-watering price rises that we're seeing. So the impetus, the urgency to do something is really paramount at the moment. And we're seeing that with the rumor, if you like, that the Treasury might pull a quick fix out of the hat. I mean, all we've really seen is a few newspaper articles around that. But there's definitely now an impetus to make sure that the electricity system is delivering to the consumer. And there is a focus and a spotlight on this dilemma, if you like, that if renewables are so cheap, if renewable prices are coming down, if we're seeing auctions in the CFD market at £50 per megawatt hour, why are consumers still paying so much? And is there a way that we can transfer some of that value or most of that value from the generators to the consumer? And how does that happen? And I think that's probably now superseded a lot of the other questions around, can we make the balancing mechanism more efficient, or how do we deal with constraints? It's kind of superseded that as the paramount question that we need to deal with. I think I'll leave it there, Merlin, and we can get into some of that in the panel discussion.
Excellent, thank you, John. It's a tour de horizon of the energy system and all the changes and the. Apologies to all those that have been working in the electricity system for the last 30 years. It probably would have picked out other highlights to me. Maybe Kathy, if I've missed something, Kathy, by all means chip in. Okay, so looking at, so we know where we are. We have an idea of history and changes. That there is some history here that is probably quite helpful to understand. The institutional memory of government is often actually lives outside government in the industry and in the market. So when they come to think about things, sometimes it's up to us to sort of remind some of that learning. But looking at the questions in the chat, a lot of them have been around. We've got Dan and there and others saying, what are we doing? And there's billions of pounds pouring into investments in energy systems. What's the objective? What are we trying to achieve here? So I'll ask you first, Kathy. What do you think the objectives are here? And maybe the other question of what should be the objectives here? I don't know if those two are the same.
Well, I actually think the objective is boringly the same thing as we've been trying to solve for quite a while, which is the trilemma. Although some of the emphasis has changed, so we're trying to get to net zero. So we've always had the decarbonisation. Now we've got a stronger target than we did before. We're trying to maintain security of supply, and we're trying to do it at low cost. And I think that is correct still. And it's always going to be a balancing act. We've had a lot more things thrown at us than before. So we've got a quicker target for decarbonisation than before. That's great. We've got the whole geopolitical background right now, which isn't really great, but that emphasises some of the other points. And then the question is, well, if we've got the same objective, why are we actually trying to change anything at all? And I think we can see that the market has worked well, in my view, but I think it's beginning to creak, is how I would describe it. And if we're going to take the big leap we have to take to get to the full decarbonisation, we've identified some issues such as, how do we build networks quickly enough? The cost of constraints is going up. How do we encourage the right type of generation? I know people are talking about the value of generation of the system. I could talk for hours about that because I've worked for all the different types, and everyone's had, in every place, we're the best thing for the system. But if you're sitting in nuclear, you'll say, oh, the wind's dreadful because it doesn't provide inertia and it's intermittent. But then if I look at big nuclear, they're the largest loss in the system. And therefore we need to hold more response and reserve. So it's actually a very hard problem. And we're beginning to see with the costs going up, etc., that what we've got isn't going to work in the future. So I think the objective's still the same, but we've just realized that we need to change things to be able to meet it.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Kathy. And Simon, well, you're not sitting in Exeter today, but sitting in Scotland generally, there's a particular energy system up there, and particular different. So yeah, what do you think the objective is? What should it be? And maybe just add a little bit, Simon, if you will, on why should anyone care? Why should 250 participants on this call kind of want to spend their July and August responding, hopefully, to government call for evidence on the intricacies of power markets?
Yeah, thanks, Merlin. So I think I'll start by largely agreeing totally with Kathy. I've always felt that the trilemma is, it's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit. We don't tend to talk about it as much as we used to, but it is almost the best articulation of what we're trying to do here. But there's a little bit more context around it, I think. So the objective that I've written down is that we need to give confidence that we will be able to provide zero carbon, affordable and reliable electricity to consumers across GB. So at the heart of that is the trilemma: zero carbon, affordable and reliable. On top of that is the fact that we have to give confidence. So doing that in 2035 or 2050 means that we need to build certain bits of the electricity system, and we need to start building them now if we haven't started building them already. So that means ensuring that the right investment is made. That kind of starts to give the confidence associated with it. The trouble is, as soon as you have a challenge which has got sort of multiple parts to its objectives and lots of different ways of looking at it, I think, as Kathy was pointing out, each individual group who knows their own sector really well and knows all the benefits that their part can bring to it, that's their focus. And what I think everyone needs to do is step back and think, okay, what is the overall system that we're going to need? And to really think about all those different components that we need to get together. So as a couple of examples on affordability as one of those components of that, and that's obviously really critical at the moment over the next couple of years. But you've got so many different bits feeding into that. So you've got the kind of the cost of capital aspect of investment, whether that's in the private sector for generation, for example, or flexibility, or in the regulated sector for network capacity. And we need to think and make sure we understand the sort of the relative size of that impact. So does, if we kind of make it really uncertain what the landscape is going to be in which a generator is operating in 10 years' time, is that going to push the cost of capital up for private investment? And how big is that impact compared, for example, with the cost and feasibility of building more transmission lines or more other elements of the system that we need? So I think we need to sort of make sure we're thinking that big picture sort of systems approach. We're all stepping back and thinking what the system needs to look like. And then I think there's another sort of element to that, which is the degree to which we need to think strategically about a plan for what that system says. Some people use the term kind of architect, system architect. To what degree do we need to explicitly lay out some kind of picture of what the electricity system in the future will look like? And to what degree are we going to not do that? And we're going to sort of try and set up a market structure, which then we hope will deliver something sort of on our behalf without us having to do the planning. And I suppose if you could kind of caricature those two sort of approaches as the kind of central planning versus liberalised markets approaches. And I'm fairly sure that neither of those in the extreme on its own is going to be the way forward. And what we need to make sure we do when we have this discussion is not say, oh, central planning is bad, central planning is like the end of the world, or the alternative, central planning is the only way we can do things. We need to like take both ends of that and kind of sort of find where the balance point, I suppose, is in the middle for those elements. Just a couple of words on this kind of Scotland as an example. So Scotland is interesting and gives us a really good case study. We've got lots of wind capacity up in Scotland at the moment, significantly more than our demand. And at the moment, that's supplemented with a nuclear station and a gas power station and a decent sort of gigawatts worth of hydro fleet up there, amongst a few other sort of smaller generation assets. And we have network capacity. But at the moment, we have significant constraints on the wind up there. We have more generation capacity that we can use or that we can export. And if we're not careful, we're going to keep connecting lots more wind, and we're not going to keep up with that with the transmission network investment in order to make sure that GB as a whole can make use of that capacity. Now, I think it's really important that we think again about all the elements of the problem. So some people would argue that, you know, we should not build. We've got 25 gigawatts of ScotWind capacity slated now for development. And there may be an argument that that's too much in Scotland. But then there's another argument that, you know, there's really good projects there, which are achievable, deliverable, well planned out, and they will provide a large chunk of the renewable electricity that GB as a whole needs. And from that perspective, it's more important to focus on building out the transmission capacity that we need to make use of that. And also to think about the role that flexibility will play in managing the mismatch at times between supply and demand, between the balance of supply and demand and the ability of networks to kind of transfer that. So I think that's a kind of, that sort of sets the scene. I'll probably come back to this later in the discussion, the kind of Scottish context. But that's part of the challenge, and that's kind of to my last part of my definition, consumers across GB. We need to be thinking not just about the GB system as a whole, but we do need to be thinking about where the generation is, where the consumers are, and how we make sure we serve all consumers and make use of the resources we've got in each different part of GB. Thanks, Merlin.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Simon. So we've heard a pretty, hopefully a good...
You are still on mute, I think, Merlin.
I could hear Merlin perfectly, Simon.
It's telling me I'm mute on one and unmuted on another, but I've unmuted on everything. Is that okay? Working okay for everyone? Yeah, I think it's just yourself there, Simon. Okay. So as I said, we've had a pretty learned discussion about the objectives, what we're trying to achieve. I think some clarity about why we might want change. Let's just it'd be good just to focus in about that there are some options arising here. We've talked very broadly, but there are some kind of front runners, and I saw those described in the recent Ofgem document. That people want to have a good summary of kind of some of the thinking here. That's good on the 8th. On the 8th, someone will probably put it in the chat, I imagine. The kind of, I suppose, broadly 3 options of kind of incremental, steady reform, splitting power markets into kind of into sort of renewables, intermittent, and long term, and a short, and another market for sort of a dispatchable short term, and then locational marginal pricing. Johnny, do you want maybe just locational marginal pricing? Do you want to give us a quick definition of what it is and why have I heard it described by some people as a no-brainer and others as the worst idea anyone's ever had?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. I mean, it is complicated, so forgive me if I'm going to have to simplify things a little bit to sort of explain it in a short period of time. And it's worth maybe going back to what our current arrangements are. So our current arrangements is that we have a single GB market. We don't have a single GB price, as some people have said. I mean, I think there's a bit of confusion there about the difference between a single market and a single price. We actually have very varied prices, and as I mentioned before, we have bilateral trading across a number of different time frames. So, but we do have a single market, which means that a generator in Inverness can sell to an off-taker in Birmingham, basically, and that transaction happens largely without considering the physical network or the physical infrastructure. I say largely because there are locational price signals through network charging, albeit those price signals tend to be quite weak, and that is currently under review at the moment, which would certainly make that consideration a bit stronger. If we move to locational marginal pricing, the basic idea is to split the network up in some way, or split the market up in some way, and it could be either by zone, or perhaps more likely, if we were to do it in GB, by network nodes. And you effectively create a market within each one of those network nodes. So you create a price driver within each one of those network nodes. And the price driver is basically around the level of constraint on the network. So if there was no constraints on the network, an LMP price would basically collapse into what we have today, which is a national wholesale market. But in the presence of network constraints, your price will vary. And if you're in an area which has got a lot of generation vis-a-vis demand and a generation constraint, then competition amongst generators will tend to drive that price down at certain times when the wind's blowing or the sun's shining or whatever. If you're an area where there is low levels of generation vis-a-vis demand, or there's demand constraint, then you'd tend to see higher prices, particularly if generators are able to use their market power within that particular node or that particular zone. So what you get from that is very strong locational price signals in the presence of network constraints. I keep saying in the presence of network constraints. So locational marginal pricing isn't about locality as such. It's not about proximity as such. It's about the level of constraint that you have on the network. One of the impacts on generators is that in that market, they no longer have the idea of a firm connection. So the right to export to the transmission network is not a given. That's part of the market function, whether they will be called upon to dispatch. And implicit within that, or perhaps explicit within that, is you move towards a more centralized dispatch function. I mean, most of the designs around LMP assume a more centralized dispatch function. And I think also, maybe Kathy can come in on this, it also kind of assumes that more people are selling energy in the maybe day ahead or intraday market. So the assumption is that people are selling energy at a marginal price within a marginal market, rather than lots of people are selling energy on the long-term basis. Now, there could be ways in which both of those could cohabit, but the basic idea around locational marginal pricing is that people are selling on a short-term a short-term basis. So it would have a big impact in terms of our whole trading infrastructure and ecosystem. It would have a big impact in terms of generation and where the risk of constraint sits at the moment. And that will affect investment decisions as well. And it, it potentially would increase or reduce consumer costs. I mean, we could, if it was implemented fully and the consumer was exposed to those locational signals to the full extent, as maybe, for instance, in Texas, then you could have big swings for consumers between very cheap energy at some times, more expensive energy at other times, and locational differences between consumers. And that's something that needs to be thought about from a societal point of view as much as anything else. And it doesn't necessarily follow. Quite a few LMP markets have either dampened or removed the locational marginal price signal for the demand consumer, particularly for domestic demand consumers as well. So that's something that could come out of the detail of the design.
Tony, could I just add one kind of obvious question? If I look at the world today, most of the generation we're planning, offshore wind, I mean, that's set by lease rounds from the Crown Estate, nuclear power, basically where the current projects are. Onshore wind, I think, has to be in a local plan now, doesn't it, if it's going to go ahead, certainly in England. So maybe that leaves solar, I guess, that's pretty locationally driven by a number of factors, such as grid, but also land availability and the like. So we are actually telling most people where to go. So the importance of locational signals, I mean, when most generation is set by government, essentially, that seems, I can't quite get my head around that.
I think that's a fair point. I think that's the idea that long-term investment decisions will be made on marginal prices is not realistic. And somebody said to me, you can make marginal changes with marginal prices, but you can't make a transformation with marginal price signals. And it's certainly true when you look at the technologies on the generation side, almost all of them are being influenced by other stronger locational signals, where the Crown Estate offers offshore leasing, for example, is, which relates to marine spatial planning. So, we've, going back to Simon's point, we probably do need more of an architecture role to think about, well, what assets do we want and where do we want them? And how are we actually incentivizing that? I mean, solar is probably one that may be more receptive to those sort of locational things. When we looked at the US markets, for example, Texas, etc., it's clear that wind wasn't really paying any attention at all to locational marginal pricing. What they were paying attention to was where the Texas state said they wanted to develop wind and where they were building transmission lines. And it's interesting that the building of the capacity for wind in Texas preceded the build out of wind, which is a kind of different model to the one that we currently have at the moment in the UK, which is more, connect and manage. So connect first and then manage the arrangements afterwards. So I think that's true. I think most people that are pushing LMP kind of accept that, certainly on the generation side. On the demand side, is there more flexibility on demand? Will we see data centers in the north of Scotland? Will we see hydrogen electrolysis in the north of Scotland as well? I mean, yes, to some extent that's probably true, but again, there are other overriding locational signals that are going on, and hydrogen in the north of Scotland, that's great, but at scale, you then have to think about how you get that to the areas of demand in industrial clusters. And actually our industrial strategy is to build hydrogen in industrial clusters. So it kind of runs against other forms of whole system strategy that we have out there. Data centers as well. I mean, when we've talked to them, I mean, they're looking for telecoms connectivity and they're looking for workforces as well. So there's other drivers around those locational signals. But I don't think that's actually the main thing behind the LMP anymore. I think it's more to do with who pays for constraints and can we pass that to the generator, which to my mind is a system move of costs around the place. And maybe can we give very short-term price signals that affects consumer behavior?
Yeah.
Okay, so Kathy, can we zero in on the investment thing? You're working for a company, you're considering investment. How does all this affect investment decisions? What are LMP or splitting the market or current things? If for all those people here who are thinking about projects and thinking about future investment, what should they be really focusing on?
And I think for different investors, it's different. So my company so I work for a Singaporean company. In the UK, we aren't interested in building wind and solar. We're there too late and the returns aren't good enough. We focus mostly on flexibility. And I've spent several months of my life explaining merchant risk to them and etc. And for me, you know, my belief is the way we look at it is there's a need for flexibility on the system and we will get rewarded for it. So the idea of the market changing and stuff, it might cause ups and downs along the way. But I think the whole discussion and seeing what is on chat is showing that when we're doing this market review, we have to get the objectives right of what we're trying to achieve. And it's all about trade-offs. And it's one of these hard problems because you've got the very high level objectives and then we immediately dive into the detail of, well, what does LMP mean for me? And, you know, I've got 42 sites. What does LMP mean for me? Well, it means that if I've got really good systems and processes, I can make more money than other people probably with my batteries and my gas engines. And it means different things for different people. And we have to realize that there is risk in the market. Like I was sitting on the ESO's panel on when they talked about LMP and they described me as the skeptic. And I was the most skeptical on the panel, but that's because I think they were only looking at one part of the problem. And LMP does solve, as Johnny says, the constraint problem, for instance, because Connect and Manage came in for a good reason. We decided when the analysis was done at the time, the extra cost of constraints were worth it for getting the renewables on quicker. Now that trade-off looks different now. The cost of constraints are really, really high. But do you have to go to LMP, for instance, to do that? Can we do something around connection agreements again? There's lots of, and this is the problem with this process, is there's lots of things to take into account. And if we don't do it in a really joined up holistic way, so for instance, we're talking about wholesale markets, there's lots of other interventions like CFDs, capacity markets, you know, people are talking about there's the interconnector incentive, etc. It's how all of this stuff works together. And people have been saying, oh, we need an incentive for long-term storage. Now, actually, I would probably build long-term storage without an incentive in my company. And we're looking at that. What we need to make sure is we don't end up with the same piecemeal problem that we have quite right now that makes it really difficult for it all to understand how it all interacts. And one good example, people are saying we have to decouple the electricity price from the gas price. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I do know that the CFD means that my retail price is lower at the minute than it would be without it. So my retail price to a degree is different. But in terms of investment, we're still happy to invest. I think for wind farms, etc., when I look at something like LMP, it's a difficult decision because you have the issue of not being able to trade to a node because the FPRs just aren't long term. It's really hard to get the investment. And I think that we may need some sort of locational signal, but I think there's different ways of doing it.
Okay, and Johnny, you wanted to come in?
I'm getting lots of yeses and stuff there. It's really hard to follow the chat, isn't it? So, yeah.
Oh, there's a couple of things just to quickly come in on. One is on the cost of constraints, and they're escalating. I mean, it's clear that they're escalating, but it's important to understand what the drivers are behind that. So when we look back at 2021, 2020, 2020, and Regen has looked at this, but I'm going to cite a piece of work that's been done by LCP because it's really interesting when they looked at the cost of constraints. So there's two sides to that equation, as you know. There's the turn down of the wind farm and paying the wind farm a compensation to be turned down, and then there's almost inevitably the turn up of some other generator in order to meet the demand that was there. And it's interesting that the cost of the constraint is the majority of it is actually on the turn up side. So it's bringing on predominantly gas-fired power stations. I think the LCP analysis, about 94% of the turn-up was gas-fired power stations. And it wasn't peaking plants, Kathy, it's mostly CCGT plants that are being used. And that cost far outweighed the turn down cost on the wind farm, because the wind farm is actually regulated to not be able to make additional profit from being turned down. So I think the turn down cost was about £50 per megawatt hour. The turn up cost is more like £200 per megawatt hour. So that kind of points to, if there is a cost here and we need to tackle it, maybe we need to think about more flexible plant that is able to provide a more surgical response to constraint and more competition on that side of the equation, so that we have competing providers of flexibility, whether it's battery storage or peaking plant, for example. And there is a shift in that direction. There's definitely been over the last 12 months, and we've been tracking it by looking at the balancing mechanism and looking at which plants are being dispatched. There has been a shift towards using more of the flexible plant, more of the energy storage providers, for example. But we're still a long way away from, you know, any sort of competitive market there, I would say. And your other point about locational signals, I mean, go back to network charging, there's opportunity there, but there's also maybe a better way of sending locational signals through the balancing mechanism also. There are locational signals in the balancing mechanism, but they're not price signals. They are signals around which plant is being called upon, the dispatch signals. And it's very clear that if you're in the right geography, if you're in the right place, your chances of being utilized in the balancing mechanism are a lot higher than elsewhere. So there's a locational signal there, albeit not particularly visible.
Okay, Simon, it was we kind of started to touch on this a bit, but obviously the burning political issue is, you know, consumer prices going up. And was Boris right to say, maybe not got a lot right recently, but was he right to say that the current system is ludicrous and that we're all paying for the, you know, despite the fact that a lot of our power is coming from plants whose costs haven't gone up, we're paying for, you know, consumers paying for all this high at the price of what's a very expensive gas at the moment. Is that ludicrous?
Don't put me in a position where I might have to agree with Boris, Merlin. I think it is important. It is really important that we look at how consumers benefit from renewables. And I think at the moment it's very clear that there are large fractions of our renewable capacity where we are not, as consumers, benefiting from the low costs that they're associated with. There are exceptions, and the big one is the one that Kathy mentioned, which is generators which are on CFDs and CFD strike price that is below the current wholesale price. For those generators, they are starting to pay back a significant amount of money. And I think that gives us a picture of how we might start to do this thing of allowing retail prices to better reflect the sort of long-term costs. This kind of concept of trying to decouple electricity prices from gas prices. I think it makes that phrase, I think, makes sense if you try to think of it relatively narrowly, as in like short-term marginal costs, at which point you might say wholesale price is set most of the time by the wholesale gas price. And so it doesn't matter, you know, if there's one gas plant on the system setting that price, and I know that's kind of like in inverted commas, it's not a precise thing, then that's kind of pushing the price up, and all this kind of cheaper stuff underneath it doesn't kind of directly benefit consumers. But I think if we move away from that short-term focus to the slightly longer term, like you get with the CFD, you start to see this. So think about a CFD generator, a CFD wind generator. 5 years ago, they made a decision to invest at a strike price, or 3 years ago, whenever it was. At that point, there wasn't any indication of the current kind of price rise associated with gas. So they took the decision that a 15-year contract at a fixed amount of money, with kind of relatively high certainty that they would be able to generate a lot of the time or recover their costs associated with not generating at certain times as well, meant that they were prepared to take 50, 60, 70 pounds a megawatt hour, even less now, for some of them. And that effectively is because almost all the cost of that wind farm is in what you pay up front. You have to sink all your costs at the start. So if you make an investment decision and you say, next year, I'm going to sink millions or billions of pounds into some capacity, I want confidence that I will kind of recover that investment and I will make a reasonable return on my investment. And that's what a CFD does. It allows generators to make that decision, and it allows consumers then long term to kind of recover that. I feel that is an example of starting to move away from short run marginal cost based pricing. And I think that's a direction of travel that is very interesting, because it starts to balance the investment need, the cost of capital effects, the reliability, the confidence that we need that this capacity will come forward, whilst also allowing consumers to benefit. There is a caveat, and it's a slight change maybe in the focus of the way consumers need to be thought about. Now, over the past kind of 6-7 years, we've had an increasing focus on the idea of choice for consumers, on the need for consumers to be able to change contracts very rapidly, not to be kind of locked into anything that's considered a long-term contract. And at the time, that may have been the right focus. But it may be, I think, that in the longer term, if we need to look at getting investment in the long term, that we need to maybe rethink that. Is kind of high levels of choice the best way to support the consumer? Or is it actually something which allows us to get to a lower overall kind of retail cost? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that's something we need to think about.
Okay, thank you, Simon. So just picking up on that then, Kathy, is there a trade-off here between the kind of cost of the cost of capital for encouraging, with plenty of people in the chat pointing out, we need a huge amount of new generation here, as well as lots of new demand technologies in a pretty short time. So, surely we just want to make sure that that's an attractive investment proposition and get people into the market, and then hopefully benefit from those lower prices of those renewables. Is there a trade-off between that and a system that reduces or increases system costs, whatever exactly system costs are? In thinking about these different changes to the market, are we trying to trade off between making investment quick and cheap and attractive and kind of cost to the system? And I guess sort of wrapped up in that as well, which maybe come to Johnny in a moment, is where do the risks, underneath that question about risk and where do risks best lie, who's best placed to manage?
Yeah, and that was the point I was really going to make, because basically my career, people who know me know that I come from the geeky side of the industry. I'm not the deal maker or anything. I spent 20-something years running modelling and analysis teams on trading and risk management. And I think it's really important, we've always got this principle in risk, that risk sits with the people that are best able to manage it. And this is something I've been pondering a lot, because of course, if you increase the risk that the generators are facing, the cost of capital will go up. But the question is that always a bad thing or not? And the thing I've been pondering a lot recently was we really lowered the barriers of entry to retail. And as a result, we got loads and loads of retail companies, and they've all gone bust now. Well, not all of them, because I'm still getting my energy, although the one I get it from is in administration. But we're sitting in a position where us as consumers are picking up the price of the risks not being managed properly. So I think it is a trade-off. And at the minute, I don't know what the right answer is. I think that it's important to get the stuff on quickly, but not at any price if we're bankrupting ourselves in the future. People who are building this stuff should be able to manage the risks. I think another question is, when we're talking about it, at the minute, someone was asking the question, sort of, who's the counterparty to the CFD? Well, it's all of us at customers right now, but it's done through a central buying. Another question might be, should it fall on the retail companies? And one of the things I think is important, that when you look at REMA, retail sits alongside it, but isn't part of REMA. And it's how those fit together are going to be really important, because if we're going to have a system that works in the future, we need a demand side supporting it. Now, not in the way people who've heard me talk, I never want to interact with my electricity bill in any meaningful way, but I am happy for people to control my system. And it's how do we get the retail, it feels like a different relationship we need with our retail suppliers in the future. In the past, it was all about how cheap can they be? Do they do customer service? And that's about it. And there was lots of churn. It's about how do we create those meaningful relationships in the future that us as retail customers can be part of this decarbonisation, and the flexibility we provide and the signals we get actually help the system as well. And another big thing in decarbonisation is how do we get more energy efficiency? Because if we can do things more efficiently, we don't have to build as much stuff. So I think it's a really complex ecosystem. And you're right, it's about where the risks sit is going to be very important. But I don't think, having learned from retail, it should be just get everything on at any cost, and the developer shouldn't have to take any risk, because they should.
And just before Simon's got his hand up, but just on that, I come to Johnny first quickly on that. Where do risks best sit, Johnny, and who's best placed to manage them? And particularly, what risk should generators?
Yeah, a lot depends what risk we're talking about there. And I mean, I agree entirely with Kathy's point about risk needs to sit with whoever's best able to manage it. And I mean, the risk of excess generation, as in we have too much energy on the system and there's no customer out there, I think that clearly does sit with the generator. I mean, the generator needs to accept that market risk. The risk that we have a network constraint, which is a different risk, I think sits better with whoever is able to plan, manage, and invest to alleviate network constraints. And that probably doesn't sit with an individual generator. Or if it does.
And Johnny, I think that's a really good point, because I think that we've been so loath to have any anticipatory spend in our networks in case we get stranded assets. I'm pretty darn sure we aren't going to get stranded assets on the network in this circumstance, where you look at how much electricity is going to have to go across them. So anticipatory build and the stuff the ESO are doing now is super important, and in the DNO space as well.
Yeah, and if we are passing some of the constraint risk to a generator via a different type of connection agreement, we've looked at active network management, for example, or flexible connection agreements. It's interesting that in our analysis, those are only really acceptable to a generator if in some way they are bounded, if there's some sort of limitation on them in terms of time limitation or in terms of the degree to which they would be constrained. It's not common, and I don't know of any examples where generators are willing to take an open-ended risk in terms of constraint. And it isn't just about cost of capital goes up, because that sounds like quite a nice little lever there. We might get a little bit less investment over a longer period of time. It's actually quite binary. If you look at the pipeline of projects that we have in place at the moment, or the willingness of projects to bid into CFDs, for example, I think the clear message is that generators and their investors are willing to give up a lot of upside value in exchange for having some sort of revenue security. And it may not be 100% revenue security, but some sort of revenue security going forward. And I think in terms of us meeting our targets by 2035, that is a reality. That's a fact of life, that we're not going to get generators building if there's an open-ended, uncontrollable risk. And the analysis we did in Texas showed that as well. Texas has an LMP market. What that did really was flip the decision. Generators wouldn't invest until the network had been increased and the capacity had been made available. So the complete reverse of connect and manage, it was more a build and connect approach, which is where we'd end up. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be a cheaper investment in the network. We might end up actually building more network in order to get the generators connected.
Perfect. Okay, Simon, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, it was kind of picking up a couple of those points. So when Kathy said about whether or not you always have to sort of minimize cost of capital, for example, or whether it's, okay for it to be not the absolute minimum. I think that kind of points to a bigger point, which is we often talk about doing this at lowest cost. And I think that's the type of wording that Ofgem has used quite a few times. It's net zero at lowest cost. Imagine there's two potential ways to do that. There's one that's lowest cost, and there's one that's not quite as lower cost, but is much lower risk and gives us much more confidence of achieving the same outcome. Now, I wonder if actually that's the right approach for us to take. So it's low cost, but also low risk and high confidence of achieving what we want to do, and that we need to consider that. So that was my first point. The second point is it is really important to think about costs overall and not cost components. So it may well be that higher cost of capital in certain circumstances or certain market arrangements is good because it can support sort of lower costs in other parts. That might not be the best example. I think by far the best example is the one that lots of people have put on the chat. I saw Randolph have mentioned it high up, and Catherine and others quite a few times. Network investment is critical to doing this. What we need to think about with network investment is not just the cost of the network and how that appears on consumer bills, but the cost of the network and what that enables in the wider energy system. And then we need to think about the impact of that on consumer bills, but also a broader society. So we need to think what that network investment does for us as a society. And there may be examples where we choose now, say we were to look at a plan for the future, and there's maybe, let's say, a dozen new major transmission lines need to be built around the country, and we build them, and maybe two of them actually, you could look at them, and individually on your own, you might say, well, actually, you didn't get as much generation developed there as you might have, as we initially thought. But over the portfolio, you have allowed a net zero system. You have taken a bit of a risk, and that risk is fundamentally on consumer money, because there's only really two places that sort of payments can come into the energy system, and it's either from consumer bills or possibly from taxation at some point if there was sort of government intervention. But it basically all comes down to our own pockets. But we do need to make sure that we balance this, and we don't just sort of think that we can do this without risk. We need to really kind of capture that risk element and make sure that is central to the decisions we make, even though it may be a little bit more complex than just sort of thinking about individual prices, for example.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Kathy, I'd just like to dig in a little bit more into a moment. I'll come back to and perhaps talk a bit more about kind of back to this question of how do we enable low cost renewables and the consumer to benefit. But just dig in a bit more into this kind of system costs, balancing costs. Sometimes it seems like I see quite a lot of, I think Dieter Helm tends to do this, and quite a lot of articles that say there's this huge cost that we might incur, and it's going up. And what are those kind of, why are they increasing? And are there other things that we can do rather than, say, locational marginal pricing that would manage those costs?
So basically, we're getting to the point we have a large traffic jam between Scotland and England a lot of the time. If you look, we've got a lot of wind in Scotland, and also periphery now, a lot of it is off the coast. And that's not where the consumers are. And this is normally where I make the joke, we could solve a lot of the problems of Scottish constraints by relocating lots of people to Scotland, but that doesn't ever seem to be that popular. But or Scottish independence might be another way, and they can sort out their problem. But the main problem is that these lines can only take a certain amount of power. And at the minute, if there's too much wind compared to the demand in Scotland, which is fairly low, then the lines would overheat when you transfer the power. So you have to do something. Now, I've seen on there, and this problem's going to get worse because we're building some new lines, hopefully the bootstraps down the East Coast, but they won't come on until the earliest to 2028. And if you dig into National Grid's website, there's loads of wonderful stuff on there, but around 75% of the time, the Scotland-England constraint, that boundary is going to be constrained. We can't get all the power out from Scotland to England 75% of the time. Now, I've seen that, for instance, Mark's put on there, oh, well, we can have long-term storage. We looked at that. because it's constrained so much of the time, you never actually get to discharge your storage. You can charge it up north of the constraint and absorb some of that wind, but it's constrained so much of the time that you can't get it out. You can't discharge. So the only thing we can really do is build more lines and build them quicker. And this is why I'm so emphatic about the LMP doesn't solve the main problem that we've got more wind in Scotland than we can get out. And those constraints are getting bigger on the east coast as well. They're moving down south of Hartlepool and it'll gradually come down the country. So that's the main problem, that we just have major traffic jams, and we can either, to solve traffic jams, you can build more roads, which of course we never like because we're environmentally friendly, or you can have less cars going through them. But if we have less cars going through it, that means less electricity traveling over the network. That either means we have to put more demand near the site of the generation. That could be people, that could be new industries, that could be hydrogen. But it's a difficult problem, and really we have to build our way out of it, in my view. But this is where
stopping us, Kathy. Why haven't we just gone on and built this network? And just thinking about costs for a moment.
I think, and maybe someone from the network side can give more. There's always been a loathing to spend. There's been this fear of stranded assets. We might end up spending too much. And I'll tell an anecdote. I said I was in the ESO for 4 years, and I was looking at Rio, and really what we were saying was we need to be bolder, and if we're going to hit the net zero problem, we need to take some risks, and not everything will work. And the regulator was going, yeah, that's good. But actually, if it doesn't work, we don't want the consumer to pay. So, okay, so you want me to take risk and I have to take all of the risk. Well, actually, you're making me very risk averse. And I think the network guys would say the same. If you look at the investment, you've got your core investment and then there's the reopeners and stuff. Is that really the best way to do it? Like, we need good regulation, but we need to think about our regulatory partnership to make sure that we are bold enough to get to net zero, because it is going to require boldness and not timidity to make this happen.
Just on costs here, Kathy, when I look at the kind of the system costs at the moment, the balancing costs, the network costs, you know, maybe it's a couple of £100 on an average bill. And I think we're seeing costs go up by about £1,500 by the end of the year due to gas price rises. So would I be right in saying that the regulator and others, by deciding they don't want to risk anticipatory investment, or they want to minimize investment and risk to consumers, have essentially landed us with a much higher bill because we have no option because the way out, the route out of relying on Putin's gas has been limited by our network capacity.
I can understand how we've got where we've got, but I think we need to change if we're going to solve the problem. That's what I'll say. It's like, I come from a trading background, and I used to hate it when my CFO would go, Kathy, why did you not sell there rather than there? And hindsight approach to life. But I think we could see a few years ago that this was becoming an issue, and we were probably too slow. But the main thing now is, what can we do to change? And this is the thing, Johnny, you're saying, should wind farm ever be exposed to constraints? I think the existing ones shouldn't, and because they came on in good faith. But should we keep piling more and more wind on and have the consumer pay for the cost of constraints is a more difficult question. Or should we, for instance, say, okay, you can build your wind farm right now, but if a particular circuit is constrained, we ain't gonna give you constraint off payments. That's your problem. But I think there has to be some sort of grandfathering, because we went into connect and manage in good faith. But one of my main questions is, between now and when we build the lines in 2028, should we continue with connect and manage, or should we do something a bit different? Because we know we're exacerbating the problem. And it might, we might say that renewable's worth it, but if we're having to constrain it off the whole time, are we really getting the power we think we are?
Yeah.
We
I think that's right,
Johnny,
Kathy.
just before you answer, we're coming sort of towards the end. We've got about 10, 15 minutes. And so just pick it up on that, and then this kind of idea of, how do we enable consumers to benefit from all this low cost renewables, these extraordinary eye-wateringly low prices of £37, 2012 prices, admittedly, for offshore wind. I think you worked out with Johnny and our team that if all the AR4 CFD projects were up and running now, they'd be paying back, been running over the last year, they'd have paid back something like £3 billion in excess in kind of back to market because of the high wholesale price and the low auction prices. So is there a basis here of a kind of new deal between consumers and renewables? And I guess that plays a little bit to Regen, and we're thinking with our members, I think we'll be setting up an ongoing working group as the REMA goes ahead. So some of the issues we might be thinking of, how do we enable consumers to benefit from low cost renewables? I think
Merlin, there is the basis of a new deal or a covenant between renewables and the consumer. The fact that renewable generators are willing to give up so much value in bidding into contracts for difference, or indeed entering into long-term PPAs, shows that there is value to be had from an exchange of low-cost energy for greater revenue security. And a greater revenue security doesn't mean 100% security. And I agree with what Kathy says, exposing generators to the right amount of risk, and there is a trade-off there, I think is important, but from our experience, it can't be open-ended. It can't be, complete risk. It has to be some sort of can be priced, contained risk, if I could use that word, or bounded risk. And I think the way forward, Simon's talked about it, we move from a marginal price system towards longer term contracts, either through the CFD mechanism or through PPAs. But an important point is not all energy can be sold on that basis. We still need to retain the short-term market, and we still need to be giving short-term price signals in order to encourage things like flexibility, for example. So this isn't a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. We need to have a balance here between longer-term contracts and short-term price signals, because the system problem that we're facing is fundamentally one about, planning and getting it right in terms of investment in network, and then having flexibility. And in order to encourage flexibility from a market point of view, we need to have those short-term price signals that flexibility providers can play off. Now, they could be in the wholesale market, or they could be also in an auxiliary market around that, where you're actually paying directly for flexibility. A good example is distribution network operators paying for flexibility through flexibility contracts to manage constraints on the distribution network. That process could be extended, and the balancing mechanism effectively pays for flexibility, so that could be extended as well. So I think there's a shift towards long-term contracts, but we need to have those short-term price signals as well. And how do we benefit? The billion-dollar question: how do we make sure consumers do actually benefit from that? I'm glad you asked me that, because at the moment that's not working. The negative CFDs that are being paid back into the levy should go through into consumer bills. The normal method is through competition, but that's a little bit like the same thing we have with fuel duty reductions on retail stations for petrol and gasoline. How do you know that actually gets paid through? At the moment, it goes through the price cap on the retail market. So we calculated by Ofgem, but how Ofgem does that calculation isn't transparent. So we really do need to have transparency to show how reductions coming through the levy from negative CFD payments are making their way right through to consumer bills. And I would almost make like a mechanistic process to take that out of the kind of competition in the retail space and say, this is what the levy is, and this is the calculation, and that gets passed through to the bill. Okay, and so that's a relatively small amount of the bill now. I think Ofgem's latest price calculation was 20 quid off the bill due to CFDs. Who knows how they got there? Who knows? But in the future, we're thinking of a market where that could be it's another way of splitting the market into two. Essentially, it's another way of making sure that And we could extend out CFDs to existing generators. We could offer CFDs to third parties. We could trade the hedging value of CFDs to third parties as well. So there's lots of things we could do to extend that market.
Excellent. Okay, Simon, I think you wanted to come in and then.
Yes, a couple of things. I think I'll pick up from Johnny's point to start with, which I really strongly agree with, that this move somewhat towards longer term contracts seems an appropriate way to do it. And I suspect that's going to involve a combination of CFDs, maybe changes that reinforce the ability of generators and suppliers to strike PPA type arrangements. I think some of the discussions of things like green power pools move in this direction as well, but I think there needs to be a lot more detail about what that actually means. I've seen some of the papers from Michael Grubb and others who are looking at that, but I haven't got enough detail to sort of see what that means. But again, it is looking at, thinking about slightly longer term. By contrast, the idea of a locational marginal price approach feels to me like it is making short-run marginal costs like more important than they are in the current arrangements, and that's one of my kind of nervousnesses about that approach. So that's my first point. I think second point on the sort of the network arrangements and this need for a kind of sort of like a real push on what we need infrastructure wise for net zero. That's going to be critical for generators. If we were to move to an LMP approach, when a new transmission link was built, or if it was built, is I think one of the biggest risks to generators. So in Scotland, for example, we have 4 cables proposed for the next 10 years to be built on the east coast between England and Scotland. They're supposed to come online in 2027, 29, and 2 in 31. So by 2031, we'll have 4 major new undersea cables linking England to Scotland. Now, if you're building out a wind farm in an LMP market, I would say the biggest risk is, do they get built? Because if they don't, you're constrained off with zero price a lot of the time. If they do get built, do they get built on that timescale, or are they 5 years late? And that can make a big difference to you as well. So I think it's really important that we think about that element. And in terms of other aspects of network development that I think are kind of important as well as cost, you mentioned the cost stuff, Merlin, but the ability to get it built involves local authorities and government making planning and consenting decisions. And there's commitments from UK government and Scottish government to speed up that process. I'm sure there is discussion of this in Wales as well, but I think that's a really big element of it. And the last major onshore transmission line we built in Scotland took something like 15 years. So that's huge, and that's kind of part of the structure and the picture that we're working towards. Okay, I think just to as we come kind of almost wrapping up, I think we maybe have a poll that we might be able to put up and see what people. Wisdom of the crowds think about the main runners and riders for market reform. So we'll see if Rachel ever can launch that. There you go. It's an untitled poll apparently. Which power market reform would you support? You only get one choice, I'm afraid. Sorry for those of you that like to be on the fence. So splitting the power market into 2, or perhaps lots of CFDs might be a version of that. Broadly the same idea. Locational marginal pricing. Gradual reform, carrying on, but let's bring flexibility, different signals into the capacity market. Let's bring trading arrangements. Let's bring the balancing mechanism more shorter period. We can think of lots of good, sensible reforms, locational pricing in charging, etc. Or just leave it alone, stop messing, and let's get on with it. Those are your options. I'm going to give people just a little bit. I'm not going to submit my own response. I won't tell you what that was. Neutrality, and we'll hopefully at some point we'll be able to bring up the results of this highly scientific, carefully summarized sample of people. But I think we're alongside that, we're just down to the last few minutes. We've had
nearly 200 people have stayed on for an hour and a half to talk about power markets. So says a lot for our audience, and of course a lot to our fascinating panel. So you got one last word, Kathy. I should take my opportunity to thank you for sitting on our board as well whilst we've got you on the call. Any last word or maybe a comment on the poll?
I would say in Northern Irish parlance, crack on.
Okay, crack on. Excellent. Simon, do you have any last thought you want to share?
Make sure we keep the overall objective in mind, and that needs to think about consumers and not just generators and network. It all needs to be driven towards that, something like that sort of statement that I said earlier, or Kathy's focus on the trilemma.
Excellent. We had the poll result flashed up briefly. Let's flash it up again. So there's not a very strong response for do nothing at the bottom. Kind of interesting. LNP not particularly popular in this audience, which is interesting. And then gradual reform and splitting the power market. Okay, interesting. Johnny, with the benefit of the wisdom of the crowds, you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that do nothing didn't get very many votes, so that's good. I think I'm inclined to agree with Kathy about cracking on, but I think we need a plan. I think we need more of an architecture than we currently have. And I'm not talking about to the nth degree, but I think that's kind of a fundamental principle that we need to adopt, and then let the markets work within that overall blueprint. And I think, it's the same thing we've been talking about, the trilemma. It's about flexibility. It's about making sure that the markets are passing those benefits back to the consumer. I just add in the urgency, because that 2035 date, which is realistically, that is the target that we've set ourselves to decarbonize electricity in order to decarbonize all the other sectors after that. I mean, that's fast approaching now. So the urgency to move ahead is fundamental. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why we need to be very careful about doing, a radical change. We need to think about how we can work with the building blocks that we currently have.
Excellent. So I think there's a vote for sort of perhaps a mix between splitting the market and gradual reform there, Johnny, somewhere in that kind of space.
Gradual reform with attitude.
Okay. Gradual reform whilst cracking on. There you go. So that's our feedback to our BASE colleagues, if they're and ESO colleagues, etc., if they're listening in. There's your consultation response. Okay. Thank you very much for everyone participating. Just a couple of things then on Regen. So say we'll have a Regen members working group in this. We're going to be talking about it. Electricity storage network who we manage. We'll be talking about it at their markets and revenues group tomorrow or Thursday. I think it's Thursday. And then we'll be I think setting up. So any members who are interested, or if you're not a member and want to join, interested in participating in that, let us know, and we'll be using that to engage with the process as it goes forward. Perhaps also mention our day in the life of net zero power system, project which we did before with ESO. We're doing the winter day. We're doing the summer day version. Simon's running and Co busy working on that at the moment, sort of on what that plan might look like, or at least how like the 2035 power system function in some of those more difficult days. So there's something to Regen thing to look out for. But I think on that note, it just remains me to thank our panel very much for learned discussion of the intricacies of power markets, and of course to thank all of you for giving up an hour and a half of a beautiful day to join us. I encourage you to go and have a cup of tea, some lunch, and perhaps maybe get down to the beach. And on that note, thank you very much. We'll leave it.
Bye, everybody.